let me welcome you today to a presentation by Professor Shoumitro Chatterjee of Penn State University, who has done a lot of very interesting and exciting work on Indian agriculture and agricultural markets. Uh, um, he is going to be presenting for about 35 minutes, Shoumitro, hopefully. And then we will have comments from Ruth Hill, who is the lead economist for the World Bank's global poverty and equity practice. I'm not going to introduce either the speaker or the discussant. They all have terrific credentials, and time is kind of valuable, so I want to jump into it. Just want to, before I let Shoumitro speak, just a small remark to remind everyone that, my experience in the last few years, even though I used to work on, manufacturing and services, after having worked in the Indian government, it's a kind of reminder that agriculture still is absolutely critical for, development prospects all around the world. And as if we need any reminder, there is a grim one now, as we know, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We see a massive increase in food fertilizer prices around the world. This is going to have major impacts, and the World Bank and others will no doubt be looking into it. But it's really another a very sad reminder about what is going on these days globally, and the global ramifications of what's happening in Ukraine. With that, let me hand over to Shoumitro. Shoumitro, you have about 35 minutes, and then after that, we'll have Ruth with her comments.
So thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be presenting to this audience. Are my slides visible? Just quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to begin by motivating based on where basically Arvind kind of left off with his initial remarks, which is to ask, why should we talk about Indian agriculture in 2022? And the reason is threefold, right? One, it has been 75 years since independence, and it's true that there has been a lot of economic growth. But what is also true is that India has witnessed an incomplete structural transformation. What do I mean by that? So even today, agriculture is about a fifth of the economy and accounts for a lot of employment in India. These numbers sort of came down in the first decade after the 21st century. That's the time when India was growing and manufacturing was booming and so on. But after the COVID crisis, these numbers are going back up. And to that extent, agriculture in India has become this absorbing state. So if something goes wrong in sort of the rest of the economy, you basically head back to your land for cultivation. And to a lot of us, the reverse migration from Indian cities to the rural areas following the initial lockdown during the COVID crisis would still be very, very fresh. Having said that, it is still true that per capita incomes in agriculture is low, which means that a lot of the poor people are associated with this sector, and therefore agriculture accounts for a large share of government spending. But it also means that this is politically an important sector. So not only farmers, but the other constituents of agriculture, which is the millers, the processors, the fertilizer manufacturers, the fertilizer importers, all are politically an important group. Now, Indian ag has received a lot of attention in the past 2 years, primarily because of the 3 farm bills, which were meant to liberalize and revolutionize Indian agriculture. This was sort of followed by protests and then by the repeal of these laws. But I want you to note something in this, which is that the focus of this debate was squarely on improving agricultural marketing. So the big question that was being asked is, what can we do such that farmers in India realize better prices for their produce? And the framing of this debate was very polarized. So you were either pro-market or anti-market. And what that framing did was that it kept us from understanding the details and the core issues. So what I'm going to do today is basically draw on some primary research that I have done together with Devesh Kapoor, Mekhla Krishnamurthy, and Mark Marshall Bouton, to shed light on the ground realities and highlight the role of regulation in agricultural markets, which was the focus of this debate. In this process, I just want to do a lot of myth busting. I want to challenge some of the very common assumptions that are made about agricultural markets. And the reason I want to do this is because in the latter half of the talk, I want to shift focus to asking what are, apart from this agricultural marketing, what are still kind of the big macro challenges for Indian ag. And I must sort of admit upfront that in this talk, I am probably going to raise more questions than I actually answer. So to begin with, what does the popularly imagined supply chain look like? I think what people think is that there are farmers who, after harvest, take their stuff to mandis to sell. Now, these mandis are the government regulated market sites where you have, again, government licensed intermediaries who buy produce from farmers. Now, the assumption is that because of the Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Acts, or the APMC Acts, there is over-regulation of these markets and marketing sites, which restricts the choice of farmers to whom they can sell. It prohibits the entry of private sector, and therefore there is a lack of investment in these supply chains, which therefore look very primitive and contributes to low incomes and low prices and incomes for farmers. So to understand this, sort of between 2018 and 2019, for a full agricultural year, the four of us, along with 14 research associates, we went to the field and we located ourselves in 3 states in Punjab, which is the key kind of green revolution state for India, and the 2 eastern states of Bihar and Odisha, to understand the key aspects of agricultural marketing, but also very closely trying to understand the lives and the business organizations of the intermediaries. And when we went to the field, like the first thing we did was to map out the supply chain. So this is the rice, just to give you an example, this is the rice supply network in the state of Bihar. And this is not a theoretical supply chain. This is an empirical supply chain in the sense that we actually followed the grain from farmer till the last point to map out where all the grain was growing and going, and who were the actors that were associated with this supply chain. 2 key things to note. One, the supply chain is anything but linear. It's a very complex network that we see. And the second is, the government forms a very, very small part of the supply chain. In Bihar, the supply chain is overwhelmingly filled with kind of private actors. If you go next door to the state of Odisha, so this is from the district of Koraput, the supply chain looks a little bit different. In the same state of Odisha, but in another district of Sambalpur, the supply chain again looks different. And so what I'm trying to convey here is that not only for the same commodity is there a variation across states, but also within the same states, if we hold the regulatory structure the same, across districts, you see a lot of variation in how the supply chain looks. Now, if you go to Punjab, which was kind of the heart of the Green Revolution in India, this is the supply chain as it looks in the district of Hoshiarpur. You start seeing something that looks very similar to the first supply chain, kind of the theoretical supply chain I showed you. And the other key thing to kind of note here is that the government procurement agency in Punjab becomes kind of the focal point of the supply chain, which is not true in the other states. So, of course, the big question is why this diversity, right? Why do we see different supply chains in different places in India? And I want to stress that only a part of the story is regulation. So, of course, regulation plays a role, right? Because for Punjab, we know that it has a history of green revolution and therefore a history of well-organized and regulated mandis. But we should realize that in the state of Punjab, for at least for paddy and wheat, the mandi or the market site is not a market kind of in a neoclassical sense. It's essentially a government procurement site. As compared to Punjab in Bihar, so Bihar has had a history of poor regulation. In fact, in 2006, they completely repealed their Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Act. And since then, it has been as free market as it gets in that state. But what do you get as a result? To kind of show this to you visually, I want to take you to the Bihar Sharif Mandi in the Nalanda district of Bihar. This market site is very, very important. The reason is that this is probably one of the largest vegetable markets in North India. So if you are a middle class, upper middle class consumer in, let's say, Delhi or Lucknow or Kanpur, your vegetables are very, very high chances that your vegetables are coming from here. So this picture was taken at the market site at 7 a.m. in the morning when there is a lot of marketing activity going on. There is no presence of government. All these are small kind of private actors. But we also took a picture of the same marketing site in the afternoon. And what you can see is like a completely dilapidated structure in infrastructure that exists. And what I want to highlight is that, look, in this state, there are no regulatory barriers to private investment. And vegetables form a very key agricultural output of the state. And yet we don't see enough of private investment either in this market or outside it. And absence of public investment has left with very poor infrastructure in the state. And so I think that a substantial part of the story, a part of the story is regulation, but a substantial part of the story is that these agricultural systems, supply chains are just evolving as a response to the existing structural conditions of production and the economy. And what do I mean by that? I'm essentially trying to say that the fact that you see many intermediaries in the supply chain basically reflects the fact that there are many, many, many small farms. And the reason that you see many, many, many small farms in India is that probably because there are few opportunities for people to work in other sectors. Since we are talking about regulation and mandis and marketing, I think at this point, it's important to ask and understand what does regulation give us, or what is the service that regulated markets provide if they work? And the history of this goes back to the report of the Royal Commission on Agriculture in India before independence in 1923. And the idea at that point was to create a focal point where you would bring together buyers and sellers, and that would in principle increase competition, right? And the idea was that these guys wanted to create an institution that would prevent traders from cheating farmers. So to give you a concrete example, farmers nowhere in the country are paid on the spot. So if I'm a trader, I would buy from you and promise you that for your produce, I will give you 10,000 rupees, but the payment will come in a week or so once I receive the payment, having sold the goods further downstream. Now, 1 week from now or 2 weeks from now, I can come back as the trader and say that, oh, I only was able to sell half your produce. The other half had moisture or it had pests. And therefore, here is just 5,000 of the 10,000 I promised. What would the farmer do in that situation? There is no recourse to dispute resolution as it happens. The mandi was supposed to solve such problems. So typically you have a mandi committee. The traders who are participating in that market would keep a deposit as security. And if they tried to cheat farmers, this committee would liquidate the assets of the intermediary and pay the farmers. The mandis similarly play a very important role in information dissemination. So think about off-mandi transactions. And again, to give you a concrete example, ITC, which is like a big wheat processor in the country, when it entered the state of Madhya Pradesh, it was procuring all its wheat off mandi. It was procuring directly from the farm gate. But how did they set the price? Essentially, you looked at the nearby mandi price to get a sense of what was the market price, and you kind of pegged your price to the mandi price. So in some sense, the mandis also play this role of information dissemination. There are other roles, for example, quality assaying and so on, that happens at this market sites. And when this works, so for example, if you go to Madhya Pradesh, when mandis work, they do a really good job of providing these services. So to me, therefore, well-regulated markets and mandis are public goods, much like a railway station or stock exchanges. And in my research, I have shown that when you have more of these well-regulated mandis, on an average, that's better for price realization. And so here I want to kind of ask, therefore, a provocative question, which is that there is good economics to say that we don't want to leave stock exchanges unregulated, because that can have all sorts of bad, undesirable outcomes. And if that is the case, why do we want to leave commodity exchanges, which are these mandis or market sites, unregulated? So if mandis are all very good and they provide us with all these services, what are the problems, and why are we having this debate at all? The reason is that initially when these mandis were created, they worked very well in terms of getting better outcomes for farmers. But over time, these APMC committees didn't always perform their functions, not everywhere at least. Incumbent traders formed all sorts of cartels to prevent entry of new players. There was a push from the center to the states to reform, but they were also not doing a complete job. So, for example, they were trying to issue licenses for trading that could be used to trade not only in one market site, but in any market site. But there you could ask a very simple question as to why do you require traders to get a new license? You could just say, if you have an existing license, that itself can be used to conduct trade in any market. And such practices led to barriers. But still, the early 2000 consensus was that we have fewer mandis than we actually need. So we need to construct more mandis, and we need better regulation. What happened in the 20 years that followed 2000 was that there was a general, again, public sort of consensus that the states were not doing enough. And therefore, the center wanted to carve out a policy scenario where the private sector could operate unhinged and unregulated under the belief that that is going to help farmers. But that's something that we should sort of empirically ask and understand. So before I go to the data again, sort of just to remind you that the whole thrust of this policy reform was on prices. And so we should understand who benefits if we try to do something on the agricultural marketing side, and what is the scope, right? And to do that, I want to take you to the ground realities and to some of the data that we kind of collected. The first point I want to make is that it is still the case outside Punjab and Haryana that a large fraction of farmers are subsistence farmers, which means that only about 40 to 50% of farmers, which are typically the large farmers, have any marketable surplus to sell. So whatever you do on the price side, for all the farmers who are not participating in the market, it's going to have a very small impact. The second sort of the assumption that these supply chains are overwhelmingly controlled by the government is also to a great extent kind of misinformed. So it is true that in Punjab, wheat and paddy is overwhelmingly procured by the government, but that is not the case in Bihar and Odisha, where this trade is mostly private. But also within Punjab, for important commodities like maize and peas, all of the trade is again with private traders. And just to sort of to show you visually, this is kind of a potato farmer in Nalanda district in Bihar, lining up their potatoes at the farm gate for sales. This is a slightly well-off upper caste wheat farmer in the same district, who therefore also has access. You can see his house is generally better than for most other farmers. He has access to an electronic weighing scale, and therefore in these private trades can often negotiate for more favorable terms than others. Sol Baga in Sambalpur is a very key location for production of chilies in the country. All the trade is private and is conducted outside these mandis, and here it is actually conducted on the side of the highway, because this is where private traders find it most efficient to kind of come and park their trucks and kind of take away the chilies. The third kind of big assumption that is made is that traders and farmers have long-lasting interlocked relationships. We again didn't find much of an evidence for this. In Bihar and Orissa, the farmer-trader relationships were very, very short-lived. Farmers essentially were choosing traders that were offering them the best price with little relation to whether you were being provided with credit or input from these people, and payments were settled very, very quickly. More in majority of the cases within a week. But of course, both in Bihar and Orissa, because regulation is very weak, there was no recourse to dispute resolution. So there were many documented cases that we had that farmers were not getting what they were initially promised. So in terms of prices, basically to summarize what we learned was that there was a little bit of wiggle room here and there. So if you were larger, if you could hold up for a little bit longer, that would give you slightly better prices. Remoteness mattered for price realization and so on, but the margins were very, very small. We were also successful in being able to capture kind of the business of the intermediaries in Bihar. And again, unlike kind of our imagination in Punjab, where the intermediaries tend to be much wealthier than the farmers are, in Bihar, the intermediaries essentially belong to the same socioeconomic status as the farmers. Essentially, more often than not, the larger farmers in the village were diversifying their business into doing agriculture, but also getting into this trading business. Their scale of operation was very small, often covering up to 5 or 10 villages and dealing with 10 to 20 farmers. To kind of give you a visual sense of what an intermediary in Bihar looks like. So this is like a wheat, maize, paddy trader in the district of Nalanda. And all of them sort of had very low profit margins, on an average between 5 to 10%. We accounted for a lot of costs that these guys incurred, but my sense is that if we try to do an even better job accounting for the costs of these people, then these margins would be even lower. Did we see presence of large companies during our fieldwork? Yes, but largely this was always driven by whenever there was demand, and in particular when there was external demand. So in Bihar, we don't realize this, but there has been kind of a maize revolution, particularly north of the Ganga, where farm sizes tend to be a little bit larger, on an average 5 to 6 acres. The maize productivity is almost as high as Midwestern United States. And all these multinational, Cargill, Dreyfus, etc., basically saw that there was an export opportunity into East Asia at a particular time period when you could do the rabi maize in Bihar. And they are the ones who procure maize from the state. But here, very important to note that these companies do not directly buy from the farmers, not because there is regulation that prevents them, but because it is efficient for them to do so. Bihar, remember, has no regulation. But what these companies say is that it is easier for them to deal with 10 intermediaries than try to deal with hundreds of farmers. Similarly, some of you may know that India is now the largest exporter of prawns and shrimps in the world. So if you're eating prawns in the US, probably coming from India. And we noticed that in Baleshwar in Odisha, all these paddy farmers had switched from growing prawns, from growing paddy into growing prawns. And here, despite the presence of an APMC Act, which regulates agricultural trade, procurement is done directly by these companies via refrigerated trucks, and they have world-class facilities exporting kind of many of these crops. So one thing I want to say is that all these things are very ethnographic things we noticed on the field. There isn't a lot of systematic data to document all of this. So it is very hard to say cross-country what is going on, because we don't do as detailed of an agricultural survey or a survey of agri-processors that would allow us to sort of notice this. But my sense is that now India is a big exporter in maize, in soybean, and in shrimps, and a lot of these new opportunities are sort of coming up. Now, to understand how we were kind of doing on the price margin, apart from just looking at it at the micro level at the field, one can also look at more aggregated data, right? So one way to sort of answer the same question is to ask, what fraction of the consumer's dollar does the farmer get? And I want to focus on vegetables, because then we don't get into issues about processing and so on. And on an average, sort of Indian farmers get about 25 to 30% of what consumers are paying. Is this good or bad? If you compare this to the advanced countries, it appears that Indian farmers are not doing that badly. You might think that US is a big country, so transportation costs are high, but then you can compare that to the UK and Germany as well, where the numbers are sort of similar, if not better. So the key takeaway from this part is that this notion that trade is controlled by the government is to large extent not true. And the margins from the marketing side may not be as big as we think they are. And it's also not the case that regulation is so much that it prevents the entry of private companies. So that brings me to the kind of the second part of the talk, which is to ask, if it's not prices, or if it's not so much prices, then where are the big opportunities? I think we should start thinking about the traditional quantity aspect, which is how can farmers produce more? And one key aspect in that is, of course, scale. If you compare the American farmer to the Indian farmer is very small, and that is not probably going to change in the even in the very sort of medium term, because we just have a lot more people in agriculture. So where else can we focus? And the second obvious thing is productivity. And here, obviously, you can do the India-China comparison and say that Indian productivity is low to less relative to the world frontier. I want to draw your attention to what we call are the yield gaps. So this is data from the Food and Agricultural Organization GAIS program, which tries to predict the scientifically achievable yields given your production conditions. So we are not comparing India to China, but India to its own potential. So given the potential, if you were to use agricultural inputs optimally, how much could you produce, and what's your production relative to that? So this is a figure documenting the ratio of the actual yields to potential yields. Three things to note. One, in the most productive regions of India, which is the Gangetic belts, the actual yields are only at about 40 to 50% of the potential. Second, you can clearly see the neglect of agriculture in the eastern part of India, where the actual productivity is only at about 10 to 25% of the potential. And the third thing is, now if you compare the India to China, China is operating for the most part very, very close to its potential, where productivity is at least around 85% of what they can achieve, right? So there is a lot of scope, and here, if we are able to improve upon technology, this is going to help the subsistence guys as well, because that is going to increase their productivity. Why has this not happened? I think a key reason that this hasn't happened is because, except for the Green Revolution, since independence, there has been a neglect of agriculture in sort of our public policy. Many ways of seeing this. If you look at government of India's total expenditure on agriculture, it's a lot, but most of it, about 70% of it, goes to subsidies and cash transfers. There is very little investment in irrigation, very little investment in agricultural research and development, and education, and creating infrastructure for agriculture. To show this to you in kind of a cross-country comparison, note the difference between India and China. So China is the red line and India is the orange line. The gap between India and China has been just exponentially increasing over the years in sort of public sector investment in ag research and development. There is also a big difference in capital formation in agriculture. So pre-1995, China is actually doing sort of worse than India in some sense. But since then, there has been an exponential rise in public investment in capital formation in agriculture. And sort of to put this in sort of layman words, it's kind of a travesty that 75 years since independence, most of our irrigation is still rain-fed. And if it's not rain-fed, then you're dependent on groundwater, in which case either you're running into sustainability challenges where you're running out of groundwater, or the groundwater is polluted, which is then entering the food system and causing all other sorts of harmful outcomes. On top of this, there has been sort of a general aversion to new technology, particularly GM technology, where several times the courts have put bans on experimentation and so on. And I think all of this has contributed to lowering productivity in the country. The third aspect about quantity is not how much you produce, but what you produce. A big challenge for us is going to be that there is too much production of cereals. We are now sitting on mega surpluses of rice and wheat, for which there is no consumption market and is probably going to be wasted. One reason that the reason to outline this is not to say or blame farmers. Farmers are doing what is best for them. They are risk averse, and rice is very suited to risk aversion, because if you talk to farmers, they're going to say it's a very robust crop. Drought or floods, as long as some stable conditions are met, you are still going to get some rice output. Even if there is no market for rice, at least you can use it for self-consumption. So we will need to design sort of policies and investment that addresses this risk aversion aspect and promotes cultivation of other high-value crops. This is happening to some extent, but not without cost. So the prawn story that I told you from Baleshwar, it's true that a lot of paddy farmers switched to prawns, but in the year that we were on the field, Odisha got hit with 2 cyclones. And so even though average incomes of farmers had increased, they had also become very volatile. And that experience is keeping more farmers from switching into prawn and shrimp cultivation. Once you convert to shrimp farming, it's also harder to convert back because the soil turns more saline. And so we will need to sort of think about strategies that help this transitions for farmers, reduce the volatility of their incomes, and so on. But at the same time, from an international kind of policy aspect, also remember that for much of this, the demand is going to come from outside and not within the country. And so we will need to follow much more stable trade policy. And the reason for external demand is just because, one, for example, if you think about processed tomato paste, Indians don't eat that much tomato paste. We like to consume fresh tomatoes, and but because we grow tomatoes, tomato paste should be something that we produce and export. And the second is that the size of the middle class, as Arvind and I had calculated in a separate paper, is much smaller in India than we think it is. So because I'm going to run out of time, I'm going to skip the part on the farm bills and just go to the conclusion, maybe come back to it later and say that I'm not trying to say that we are doomed, but that we need some coherent vision of what the future for Indian agriculture is. Maybe there are gains from marketing. My sense is that they are small. But while we address these issues, we must be cognizant of market power issues. We should really introspect this claim that replacing many small intermediaries with a few large firms is going to be unequivocally a good idea, because there is enough evidence from across the world, different countries, both advanced and developing, that it often leads to, again, undesirable outcomes. And basically, what I wanted to do today was to kind of shift the focus from marketing to kind of highlight these more macro challenges. And I want to end by saying that at some point we are going to need consolidation, but consolidation means that people will need to exit from agriculture. And for that, what is going to be key also is low-skill jobs, both in manufacturing and services, because if that does not happen, we will still have a large fraction of the population kind of stuck within agriculture. So with that, let me stop. And
great. Shoumitro, thanks for that terrifically clear and comprehensive presentation. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Ruth to offer her comments on Shoumitro's presentation. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to be a discussant on Shoumitro's work. I really enjoyed reading your work, Shoumitro, getting into it more than I had done before over the last couple of weeks, and also going through the slides that you had sent over the weekend and were presenting today. The way I have sort of structured my comments, I don't have a PowerPoint, is to really outline 3 reasons why I like this work so much, and sort of by doing that to sort of outline sort of how I think this work is relevant for other countries as well beyond India. So first off, I mean, a lot of your work, Shoumitro, really does take this question of agricultural markets centrally. And I really like that, because I do, and this is maybe where I'd like to get into a bit of a discussion with you, sort of like, what is the role of focusing on markets, sort of that you got to at the end, is I really do think agricultural markets are important for development. So a quick sketch of my thinking here is that, you know, many households remain in agriculture, many poor households. A focus on agriculture alone is not going to get them out of poverty. But as you mentioned at the beginning, these sectoral shifts take time. And so for, you know, a good number of years still, we're going to see a lot of poor households engaged in agriculture. We have to think about how to increase their incomes. But we have to think about how to increase their incomes in a way that doesn't prevent them from making those sectoral shifts and moving out of agriculture. And so a good way to do that, in my mind, is a focus on addressing market failures. Market failures in factor markets that sort of prevent some of these adoption of some of these production technologies and practices that would move them closer to the frontier in your sort of yield maps at the end. And, you know, and I think what is often neglected is this issue of the role of output market failures. And it was very, very interesting to me to hear you characterize the policy debate in India recently as being very much focused on the price that farmers get. And just to note that that is actually really often different to where the policy debate is on agricultural issues in a lot of other countries. So a lot of the countries that I've worked in, certainly in Africa, the focus of the ag policy debate has been really around how do you increase quantity. There's very little discussion of the marketing or the price side of it. But as you sort of started to note, this relationship between quantity and price is very symbiotic, right? So the quantities that farmers are going to produce is going to affect what the market structure looks like. But in turn, and something perhaps you didn't talk to so much, was that increasing quantities without getting the incentives right is a really tall order. And some of the features of the market system that you've really nicely characterized make it really challenging to have those incentives right. Some of that's going to be about price. In some cases, prices may be a good share of the final price, but they're still going to be too low to incentivize some investments to be made. Those maps of yield gaps don't take into account that there's about yields, it's not about returns. And sort of the Uju Rosenzweig paper shows that in many cases, prices are just not always going to be high enough to ensure a return to some agricultural technology adoption. But additionally, sort of the spot market nature of markets, of this, selling to a buyer you've probably not sold to before, receiving payment almost immediately after you sell, very little upfront payment. I mean, that's very familiar to me. It's what I've seen a lot in agricultural markets in Africa. But it results in massive amount of price uncertainty, severe liquidity challenges for farmers, both of which limit investment. And also the lack of repeated transactions or branding does limit the degree to which you can start to reward some unobservable characteristics of products that you might want to start being able to reward in a more developed market structure. So although I think it's very difficult to say what's more important, price or quantity. I think both are important, and there's this sort of deep symbiotic relationship between the two. But just a couple of studies that were very interesting to me in the last few years, both actually RCTs from West Africa, that highlight how addressing market challenges can help on improve productivity. And I just wanted to sort of mention those here. So one is a study that was in Benin by Aruna and others, published in 2019, which showed that they tried a bunch of different contracts in a contract farming situation to farmers, some where there was some upfront support for inputs, others where there wasn't. And actually just a simple contract that did nothing else than provide some price certainty was enough to increase productivity. All those other add-ons were not necessarily needed to see these productivity effects, which was kind of a nice way of showing just how important sort of getting some market things can be for incentivizing production. In Senegal, Tanguy Bernard and others show that introducing weighing scales and grading in onion markets did result in investments in onion quality, which hadn't been there until there was better ways of sort of rewarding that in those markets. And I think I've also seen situations where sort of an excessive focus on quantity can just sort of result in prices collapsing, and then farmers sort of not undertaking those investments a few years later. And I'm thinking here of maize in Ethiopia in the early 2000s, and then sort of tomatoes actually in Burkina Faso sort of 5 years ago. So I think I think that one of the things that I really, really like about your work is that you are really sort of looking at what I think is this really important issue, and we can sort of discuss a bit more sort of, where the balance needs to be, and the balance probably needs to be different in different countries. Second reason why we've really appreciated the way you ran through the work that you've been doing and the careful work you've been doing in the last few years is that we often don't have enough good empirical work in development economics on agricultural markets. I think it's often sort of a more neglected topic than looking at how to the drivers of agricultural technology adoption, for example. The number of well-identified studies is much smaller, and that goes right back to the data we're collecting. So sort of taking some of these sort of agricultural surveys, and I was just wanting to check myself to see whether I was sort of correct in my assumption on this. And I took a few of these agricultural LSMS surveys that have been implemented in a number of African countries. I was just looking through those surveys again and seeing, yes, I had the right sense of it, which is that we see that, so taking, for example, the last Ethiopia one, 25 pages of questions on how households are producing, 2 pages on how they're selling. And those 2 pages don't cover many of the important topics that you collected data on, such as, are you selling to a buyer you've sold to before? When did you receive payment relative to when you delivered the crop, and so on. And as a result, we're in a situation where we have, a lot of myths, as you rightly put it, that are guiding policy making. And I really like the focus of your work on myth busting and on doing really good, careful data collection to say, okay, well, what actually is driving what's going on in these markets, and really showing that, for example, some of the myths that we have around sort of the unscrupulous trader taking advantage of farmers, that is very much sort of pervades a lot of the policy discourse, that we need to unpack that a little bit. There may be some situations where this may be happening, but these are markets with free entry very often, and very often not many regulations. So how do we understand them? And I think your work does that really well. One question on that I was really curious about was just to understand a bit more the price wedge data, because it is so striking. And so I would be interested in sort of understanding the degree to which these numbers are comparable across countries. To what extent are we comparing like with like? These are really hard numbers to get right. And so just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that, and, how much weight you would put on that, and whether we've got these comparisons right across countries. I think another challenge in sort of doing this descriptive work in agricultural markets is the variance that we see, right? And that, we might often see very small margins for many intermediaries, but every now and then they'll have these transactions which give them a massive margin. And how do we take account for that variation in this descriptive work that we're doing, I think is a really, really big challenge. So moving finally on to my third reason why this work is so great, is that I think that even though I think agricultural markets are really important, it doesn't mean that the answer to improving them lies in market interventions. And I think you hold this challenge really well and balance really well in your work. Yes, regulation standards are important. There's going to be often a lot about infrastructure. It's going to be a lot about increasing demand, and that's going to require non-agricultural growth. I think sort of Bart Minton's work in Ethiopia looking at the teff market as Addis Ababa grew and as the middle class in Addis Ababa grew is fascinating in this regard. And you see sort of a market structure going from very nascent to being much more sophisticated and much more efficient. I hadn't thought about this idea of this labor side of that story, that we need to, that some of the challenge of agriculture markets maybe needing to take labor out of that sector. I think that's a really nice thought. It reminded me of a paper that I wrote back 20 years ago with Marcel Papchance in Uganda, where we saw that as coffee prices were increasing, we saw many more traders entering into the market, and that we did in fact see an equilibrium where you just had too many traders in the market. That model did, however, require that farmers didn't have good access to information. So it suggests that there may be sort of this other channel by which to address this. But overall, I think this is a really key point, that increasing demand and also thinking about how you change the structure of supply. How do you, maybe you're not going to change the scale of production, but how do you increase yields? How do you also increase specialization? I think that's been a big story in some of the Eastern Asian countries. I'm thinking here of Vietnam, where you've seen you haven't seen any change in farm sizes over time, despite people moving out of agriculture because of population growth. But you've seen incredible amounts of specialization, and as a result, much more commercialization and more developed markets as a result. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great, Ruth, terrific comments. Thanks so much for offering them. I was just wondering, Shoumitro, before I turn over to, kind of picking up on some of the questions, do you want to respond to Ruth, or shall we go straight to the questions and have you come back to respond to Ruth? Your call.
So we have 10 minutes. Let me first respond to her very quickly, because I think it's a much longer conversation, and then maybe take a few questions from the audience.
Yeah.
So Ruth, thank you very much for those comments. I guess we have very little disagreement. We share most of the same feelings. So let me just touch up on a few points, and then I guess we can take the conversation a little bit offline. I think where I was coming from was definitely not that there can't be improvements that can be done in these agricultural markets, but those improvements should take the form of better public investments, and better regulation rather than deregulation, right? So even take something like information, which information frictions have been thought about to be like a big problem in these markets. And again, like all the RCTs that Marcel has run in India have essentially thrown up null results, showing that either farmers have this information already, or they, even if you give them this new information, they can't sort of take advantages of it. So maybe kind of the friction is elsewhere. Again, like in India, there was this belief definitely before the laws that you did not get contract farming, or you did not get entry of private players because there were some barriers to entry. And what I want to highlight is there is already a lot of private sector, both small and big businesses. In urban India, now you have these supermarket chains that supply to consumers. But my parents, for example, even though they have a supermarket, they would go and buy from the local guy who sells on the roadside, because they say that's where we get better quality at a lower price. And I wonder how much of that has to do with barriers to entry rather than just how systems are evolving and improvement as development in India kind of takes up. The shrimp story that we saw in Odisha, there is no written contract, but in some sense, it's sort of the contract farming that we imagine is going to eventually evolve. So all the inputs in this case, the lines, the seed, the feed for the shrimps are provided by these farms. Throughout the growing process, they will send their agents who would monitor the growth of, because if it turns like a centimeter this way or that way, they lose profit. So they want to help the farmers get the best output. And then they have this, you can call it an association or a cartel, but they have essentially fixed a formula. If international prices of shrimps are X, we are going to give farmers X minus something, and all these processors give the same price, so they don't sort of compete or undercut each other, and therefore they also share resources in offering help and advice to the farmers. That has definitely increased incomes for farmers, but again, it has not increased like 200 times the way we imagined that these things would. So my sense is that such contract farming is very prevalent in fruits, for example, but it only happens when there is demand. If there is no demand, then you don't see entry of the private sector. And my sense is that then we mistake that to be to take that there are some frictions. And again, like there are no like proper experiments that have been run, but I think that's the puzzle that we are kind of facing and we need to solve. You're completely right about the price wedges. It's sort of super hard, which is why I picked like a few countries where I found studies that were, so the Indian study was done by Dr. Gulati at ICRIER, and they claimed that they followed the potato or the tomato from the farmer to the consumer, and they're comparing a commodity that had not changed farm over relatively short distances within the same state. And I tried to pick up similar things from Europe. I didn't show like more countries because that's where these problems would be bigger. But I think we need to do more work on this, because if you look at these margins in the US, forget the levels, the gaps have, like, there has been like a secular increase in the gap between what the US farmers are getting and what the US consumers are facing. And this is where you think that the agricultural markets are completely liberalized, but then why are we seeing what we are seeing? I didn't get a chance to talk about weighing scales. We had this interesting finding on the weighing scales. So Punjab has this heavy regulation, whatever. But even with regulation in Punjab, all traders use manual weighing scales. They won't allow you to use an electronic weighing scale. In Bihar and Odisha, which is sort of slightly more not as well developed, kind of more free market, the farmers have a lot of power. So even when sales are farm gate, they force that the weighing scales that are used are electronic weighing scales. There wasn't enough variation in the data to kind of tease out like what were the margins on the basis of these scales, but just the juxtaposition that in a very sort of regulated market, you were getting manual weighing scales, and in the other one, you were getting electronic weighing scales was a very fascinating one. Let me kind of stop there. We maybe can take some, yeah.
Okay, Shoumitro, let me, we have a few questions from the audience. Let me read them out one at a time, and maybe you can respond. The first question from Seth Gartz is, can you discuss the presence, absence of financing, kind of both credit insurance in the value chains, and how it enables, constraints, efficiencies in market access?
Insurance in general is very hard, and I think Ruth should speak about it more than I should. My sense is that insurance, unless there are massive public subsidies, insurance doesn't work anywhere in the world, let alone India. The government has tried to do crop insurance programs, which is, so if you take like a government bank loan for agriculture, insurance is tied to it, and that's the only take up of insurance. Farmers don't voluntarily take up insurance. I was talking to Javi Jean yesterday, who has done a lot of work on insurance in India, and he was saying there is sort of the same problem of the take up of insurance. So I think there is a insurance market problem with agriculture in general that we need to understand better. On credit, there are three forms of credit. So in the states that we were in, the largest provider of credit were cooperative banks. There has been a lot of formalization. So farmers are picking up credit from what is called the Kisan credit card or the farmer's credit card, not so much from formal banks. And there was, again, a very sort of key ethnographic insight that we learned. So the Indian financial year goes from 1st of April to 31st of March, but the Rabi season cultivation harvest happens after that. The banks force the farmers to repay the loan by 31st of March, which is when the harvest is not ready. And so the farmers say that doesn't work for us. And they said that's a big reason, at least in the eastern parts, why we don't take institutionalized credit, but we try to borrow from local money lenders. But it is certainly a challenge in trying to expand their scale and so on.
Right. So Prashant, Shoumitro, Prashant Yadav Arun from CGD has a question. Given the nature of your debate, what is your opinion regarding the effectiveness of the price discovery mechanism in the mandis? Is there a mechanism design problem to be solved through which the farmers obtain better prices in the mandis, or is it just not worth it?
I think the question should be broken up into sort of two parts, which is what happens to price discovery when there are no mandis versus when there are mandis. And I think we can unequivocally say that when there are publicly regulated markets, whatever mechanism is put in place on an average does better when there are no mandis, which is when you are just doing farm gate sales. So in Bihar, for example, farmers have no clue as to what the market price is. Basically, traders are coming to your farm gate and telling you what the price is. If you have a cell phone, maybe you know a little bit better, but you really don't know what is happening in the local area. You go to Madhya Pradesh, there are mandis, there are maybe auctions, maybe the auctions are rigged, but there is a price discovery that happens in the mandi, and that information percolates. Now, these auctions are rigged, and that's a problem, and we need to be able to do better. So, for example, the auctions in many of these markets are non-binding. We come up with an outcome, both parties can renege on the outcome of that process. In many cases, it just breaks down to bilateral bargaining. Farmers also pay a huge fixed cost. So I've gotten my stuff, we bargain, you offer me a price, I agree, I unload my stuff, and then you say, oh, the top of the grain was very good, but the bottom part looks bad, so I'm only going to offer you 80% of what I initially quoted. Given my fixed cost, I have no recourse but to have to kind of sell you to that. But the only way to kind of improve upon all of this is, again, sort of trying to sort of design a better regulatory structure which could improve price discovery.
Okay, there are two tricky questions now, Shoumitro. One is kind of a kind of all-encompassing question of what, according to you, are the important reasons for the inefficiency of Indian agriculture. So, I think that'll take maybe 2-3 lifetimes to answer, and whatever you want to take a stab at it. And then there's someone who's really pleading with you to comment on the 3 farm laws.
I don't. There are many reasons for the inefficiencies. If I start making like a laundry list, we will probably never end. But there are land market issues. Diego Restuccia has done a lot of work on that. You can look at Ruth's work on insurance. Harvey Jean has worked on that. Productivity, everything we talked about. So the whole kind of laundry list. I don't know where the bigger gains are, but let me kind of stay away from that question. On the farm laws, actually, let me just show you one slide, which I did not show. I think people misunderstood that farmers were kind of reacting in trying to maintain like benefits that they would have lost. There were real reasons to be suspicious of the laws. So on contract farming, and sort of Ruth brought up contract farming, one way the laws tried to promote contract farming was to put in the act that farmers would be prevented from going to court if they so desired, if a contract, say, failed or something. You wouldn't expect that happens in any democracy. And so, of course, farmers were suspicious. I brought about the thing about stock exchanges, and why would you, if you don't want to deregulate stock exchanges, why deregulate commodity exchanges? Again, like in an agricultural bill, you would expect there to be everything related to agriculture, but you had this clause which said nothing in this act shall be applicable to stock exchanges. You didn't have to put it, but given that you were incorporating something about stock exchanges in an agricultural bill, again raised suspicions as to why were you treating stock exchanges and commodity exchanges differently. The other part was that, look, one of the stated objectives of this bill was market integration, but we really have to ask whether the bills were really integrating markets. So they were finding a roundabout way of achieving what they thought was market integration. So before the bills, or even today, the status quo is that different states have these different tax regimes because of the different APMC acts. What the bill was trying to do is carve out areas within the state which did not fall under the purview of the APMC and say that those specific regions were free trade areas. So then in India, instead of having like 26 different regimes, you would have had hundreds of different regimes with some controlled by the APMC and the other controlled by the central legislation. So in effect, you would have gotten something that looked less like an integrated market, but more like segmented market. And again, I didn't talk about this, but this whole idea of bringing in big private players without enough of a regulation works under the assumption that when small intermediaries who have little market power are replaced with large players, that's going to be better. But there are going to be two kind of conceptual forces, right? One, of course, there are going to be benefits because of an increase in scale. But if you reduce many players who offer much more competition with few players, the degree of competition is obviously going to come down, which has happened in the US and so on. And what is going to happen in the balance is something that shouldn't sort of be taken for granted. That's, I think, all that I want to say about the farm bills for now, because they are history anyway.
Yeah. Ruth, would you like to add anything in response to any of the questions, or in response to what Shoumitro has said? Okay, I think we have gone past our allotted time. That's partly because I think the discussion was so engaging and thoughtful. The questions were very good. So I think let me just conclude by thanking everyone for joining us for this presentation. But above all, I'd like to thank Ruth for terrific comments and thoughtful discussion, and Shoumitro for an excellent presentation. I hope very much that at CGD we can focus a lot more on agriculture, not just in India, but in other parts of the world. Because I think if there's one thing, and let me throw out this final thought, controversial thought, my working hypothesis is that the only cases of successful overall convergence are those countries that achieved rapid agricultural productivity growth to the frontier. So agricultural convergence is kind of an absolute necessary, maybe sufficient condition for overall convergence. And if all of you read How Asia Works by Studwell, I think it's a great kind of discussion of this hypothesis that I think that comes out from reading the book. So on that kind of slightly pompous note, let me conclude this and thank you all for coming. And Shoumitro and Ruth, thanks again very much.